In today's video, you'll hear the story of a reclusive designer whose fragile grip on reality begins to crumble after he buys a seemingly harmless landscape painting from a thrift store. The story begins 1 week after his purchase, in the dead of night, when the impossible could no longer be denied. The air in Arthur's office was thin, heavy with a stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. The low hum of his computer was an island of normalcy in an ocean of unnatural silence, a silence that had settled not in the house, but within his own mind. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, cold and stiff, not from inactivity, but from a paralysis spreading from the nape of his neck to his limbs. The work on the screen, a complex branding project with a looming deadline, was forgotten. Its vibrant colors and clean lines an insult to the murky confusion overwhelming his perception. His eyes were fixed on the opposite wall, locked onto the oil painting he had impulsively bought 7 days prior. It was a landscape, or at least it had been just a landscape, a field of tall, golden wild grass rolling under a dramatic late afternoon sky, but the scene's serenity had been violated. In the deepest point of the canvas, where perspective forced detail into mere suggestion, a new form asserted itself. It was a geometric structure, minuscule from the fabricated distance, yet unmistakable in its architecture. A gabled roof, the line of a porch, the symmetry of 2 upstairs windows. Arthur tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline. He didn't need to move closer to confirm what his panicking brain had already processed. The silhouette was a perfect replica, an architectural echo of the very house that sheltered him at that moment. It was his house, shrunk and imprisoned on the canvas, a tumor of reality growing in a world of oil and paint. The memory of the purchase was now a source of torment, a film replaying in his mind as he searched for a clue, a warning sign he had missed. It was last Tuesday, during a rare escape from his self-imposed confinement. The thrift store, an anachronistic establishment squeezed between a loud laundromat and a shuttered convenience store, had caught his eye. It wasn't a place he would normally enter. His life and home were curated with a minimalist's precision, an antidote to the world's messy intrusions. But something that day, perhaps a profound weariness with the sterility he had built, compelled him inside. The air within was a physical entity, a dense miasma of mothballs, old varnish, decades of dust, and the phantom perfume of countless previous owners. It was the scent of decay, not of organic matter, but of memories. Objects were piled without logic, chipped furniture, limbless mannequins, boxes of faded photographs, each item an artifact from an interrupted life. Arthur navigated the narrow aisles, feeling the weight of gazes from portraits whose eyes seemed to follow him, a sensation he dismissed as a tired horror cliché. And then he saw it, leaning against a back wall behind a broken rocking chair. The landscape. It wasn't frightening. On the contrary, it was calming, a window to a peaceful, unpeopled world. An escape. Its size was perfect for the bare wall in his office, a space he stared at for hours on end, willing inspiration to come. At that moment, it seemed like a solution, a piece of cheap beauty to break the monotony. The shop's owner emerged from the backroom shadows, as if conjured by Arthur's decision. Mr. Elias Croft, as a small yellowed business card on the counter read, was as old and dusty as his merchandise. His skin was a thin parchment, stretched over a delicate bone structure, and his eyes, a watery, pale blue, seemed clouded, as if a veil of cataracts or of time itself separated him from the present world. He moved with a deliberate slowness that was almost hypnotic, his feet making no sound on the wooden floors that creaked under Arthur's weight. When he spoke of the painting, his voice was a dry whisper, the sound of dead leaves scuttling across pavement. He offered no history or provenance, only remarks on the quality of the light, the way the unknown artist had captured a moment of stillness before the night. There was a reverence in his gnarled hands as he touched the frame, a care that seemed disproportionate for a sale item in a junk shop. He sold it for a pittance, a price so low, Arthur felt a pang of guilt. But Mr. Croft's expression was not one of a man making a bad deal. It was one of satisfaction, a thin smile that didn't warm his eyes but carried the weight of a completed transaction, of a cycle perpetuated. While helping Arthur carry the canvas to his car, the old dealer held it for a moment too long, his gaze fixed not on Arthur, but on the painted surface, as if bidding farewell to an old acquaintance or an old burden. The drive home was strangely tense. With the painting in the back seat, Arthur found himself glancing in the rearview mirror at every stoplight. The glare of street lamps on the canvas's varnish created reflections that gave the illusion of movement. The crimson clouds seemed to churn, the golden grass to sway in a non-existent breeze. He felt foolish, his suggestible mind turning a simple purchase into a premonitory event. At home, the task of hanging it was a ritual. He measured the wall with millimeter precision, wiped the dust from the frame with a soft cloth, and positioned it exactly in the center, at eye level with his office chair. The piece immediately transformed the room. The space, once a white, impersonal cube, now had a focal point, a depth that wasn't there before. The window to that deserted field brought a sense of peace, a quietude that complemented his own reclusive temperament. That first night, he worked feeling less alone, occasionally lifting his eyes to the serene landscape. The painting was a silent companion, a presence that demanded nothing of him, and for that he was grateful. The impulse buy, he concluded, had been a success. The monotony was broken. He did not yet know that monotony was safe, and that what the painting offered in return was a different kind of quiet, an expectant, predatory silence. The work itself was a masterful study in ambiguity. The artist, whose signature was an illegible K. Sternwood in the bottom right corner, was a master of light and atmosphere. The technique was impasto, with thick layers of oil paint applied with a palette knife, giving the grass and clouds a three-dimensional texture that felt alive. Up close, the scene dissolved into a chaos of slashes and ridges of paint. From a distance, it coalesced into an image of photographic clarity. The palette was limited but used to devastating effect. Shades of cadmium yellow, Mars orange, burnt sienna, and a touch of cobalt violet created a sky that was at once beautiful and ominous, the kind of sunset that precedes a storm or the end of something important. The field of grass dominated 2/3 of the canvas, each stalk a unique vertical stroke, creating a dense, impenetrable sea. There were no paths, no fences, no sign of human intervention. It was primordial, untouched nature. As a designer, Arthur appreciated the composition. The artist had used the rule of thirds in a classical yet subversive way. The focal point wasn't an object, but emptiness itself, the vast expanse of field and sky. It was a painting about nothingness, about solitude, a perfect mirror for Arthur's own life. In those first few days, he studied it with a clinical eye, admiring the technique, the compositional boldness, the way the light seemed to truly emanate from the canvas, an internal glow that subtly illuminated the wall, even when the room's lights were dim. Arthur's routine was the foundation upon which he had built his sanity. Wake at 7, coffee, 2 hours of coding before checking emails, lunch at noon, always the same prepackaged salad, an afternoon of intense work, focused on the projects that allowed him to interact with the world through a firewall of digital contracts and briefs. He rarely left the house, save for his essential weekly grocery run. His home was his sanctuary and his fortress, a controlled environment where there were no surprises. Silence was his soundtrack, a silence that allowed him to focus, to create, and to exist without the friction of social interactions he found so draining. The painting integrated itself into this routine. It became the point to which his gaze would drift during breaks, a visual respite from the blue light of his monitors. Its presence was a constant, an immutable element in his controlled universe, and that was precisely why he, and perhaps only he, would be able to notice. His mind, trained to identify the slightest variation in a color tone, the misalignment of a single pixel, the inconsistency in a layout, was uniquely tuned to perceive when something was out of place. His reclusiveness wasn't a weakness. It was a sharpened observational instrument. He lived in a perceptual laboratory, and the painting, unbeknownst to him, had become his newest and most volatile experiment. The first hint came on the third day. It was a fleeting sensation, a thought dismissed almost the instant it was formed. As he got up for more coffee, he cast a casual glance at the painting and had the impression that one of the purple hues in the sky was darker, deeper than he remembered. He paused, tilting his head. No, it was just the light. The afternoon was overcast. The room's illumination was different. He walked up to the canvas, analyzing the area. It was the same mixture of violet and sienna he had admired before, a trick of his eyes, fatigued from hours of screen time. He shook his head and returned to his desk, chiding himself for his overactive imagination. The next day, the feeling returned. This time, it was the grass. A small section in the center seemed flatter, as if a breeze had passed over it. Again, rationalization came quickly and easily. The morning sunlight, hitting from a different angle, was creating new shadows on the thick texture of the paint. It was logical. It was perfectly explainable. But the explanation did not quiet the small seed of unease that had been planted in his mind. He began observing the painting with more intention, no longer as a work of art, but as a puzzle. He took a high-resolution photo with his phone, a reference point, an anchor to reality. Now we'll know, he thought, feeling slightly foolish but also vaguely reassured. The reassurance lasted less than 24 hours. On Friday, a torrential downpour punished the city all day. Arthur's house was dark and gloomy, the sound of rain on the roof a constant drumming. He worked with his headphones on, immersed in his project. When he finally took a break in the late afternoon, the first thing he noticed was the painting's atmosphere. The sky, once a vibrant sunset, now looked dull, muddy. The vivid colors were gone, replaced by shades of gray and a somber blue that perfectly mirrored the weather outside. The internal glow he so admired was gone, leaving the canvas looking flat and lifeless. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He quickly pulled up the photo on his phone. The phone screen glowed with the warm, vibrant colors from the day he'd taken it. He looked from the phone to the painting, back to the phone. The discrepancy was undeniable, jarring. It wasn't a trick of light. Ambient light could not selectively drain the pigments from an oil painting. It was impossible. He moved closer, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath short and shallow. He touched the surface of the canvas. It was dry, inert, but his eyes were not lying. The painting had changed. It was reacting to the outside world. The window to a peaceful field had become a mirror to his own gloomy, isolated environment. And that led to tonight, Saturday, one exact week since the purchase. After the incident with the rain, Arthur had spent the day avoiding looking at the wall. He focused on work, with a desperate ferocity, trying to drown himself in the logic of code and design. But the painting's presence dominated the room, a black hole of attention that pulled at his thoughts. Finally, around 2 in the morning, he couldn't take it anymore. He had to know. With a knot in his stomach, he slowly swiveled his chair. The sunset colors had returned, perhaps a little less vibrant, but they were there. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. It had been stress, lack of sleep, the dim light. He was letting his imagination get the better of him. He smiled, a shaky, self-mocking smile. And it was in that moment of relief, that instant his guard was down, that his eyes focused on the horizon line. And he saw it. Not a shift in color or light, but an addition, a solid form, an object that did not belong in that world. The house, his house. He shot up from his chair, sending it rolling backward into the wall. He stood there in the middle of his silent office, his chest rising and falling rapidly, as the real world and the painted world collided before his eyes. He approached, his face inches from the canvas, the smell of oil and varnish filling his nostrils. He examined every detail of the miniature house, the small porch, the placement of the windows, the slope of the roof. It was perfect, a flawless replica. Terror enveloped him like a cold shroud, but the worst was yet to come. As his wide eyes traced the structure's impossible lines, they settled on one of the upstairs windows. His window, his bedroom window. It was not just a black square of paint. There was something more. In the center of the tiny dark window of the painted house, a minuscule and almost imperceptible pinprick of yellow light was glowing, as if someone inside had just lit a candle. That pinprick of light, that tiny, impossible star, held Arthur's entire universe in its grip. He was motionless, his face inches from the canvas, his own warm breath fogging a small patch of the century-old varnish, momentarily obscuring the painted field. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his shirt, a frantic, reflexive gesture. He needed to see. He needed to be sure. His mind, a frantic librarian of logic, was scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a flaw in the canvas he'd never noticed, a fleck of brilliant yellow ochre that had caught the light in a new way. Perhaps it was a tiny hole in the fabric of the painting, allowing the white wall behind it to peek through, illuminated by the lamp on his desk. He leaned back, changing the angle of his view, blocking his desk lamp with his body, plunging the painting into the room's ambient shadow. The light did not vanish. It remained, a steady, self-contained glow. It wasn't a reflection, it was a source. This single fact dismantled every rational construct he had frantically built. The addition of his house to the landscape was a spatial anomaly, a rupture in reality. But this light was something more profound. It implied occupancy. It implied life. The horror shifted from being about a place to being about a presence. The question was no longer just how his house had appeared in the painting, but who had just turned on the lights. A cold wave of analytical fury washed over his panic, a defense mechanism honed by years of professional problem-solving. If his senses couldn't be trusted, if reality was now subjective, he needed objective data. He retreated from the painting and strode to his closet, his movements stiff and robotic. He pulled out his professional DSLR camera, its familiar weight a small comfort in his hands. He retrieved his heavy tripod, extending its legs with sharp, metallic clicks that echoed in the silent house. This was his process. This was control. He was no longer a victim of a hallucination. He was a researcher documenting an anomaly. He positioned the tripod a precise distance from the wall, mounting the camera and fitting it with his sharpest macro lens. He spent the next hour in a state of intense, obsessive focus, treating the supernatural event as if it were a product shoot with a difficult subject. He adjusted his studio lights, positioning them to eliminate any possible glare from the varnish. He tethered the camera to his computer. a live feed of the painting appearing on his largest monitor. He took dozens of photographs, bracketing the exposures, varying the aperture, all in a desperate attempt to capture the truth of that single, glowing pixel. He was a scientist in a haunted laboratory, using the tools of his trade to wage war against the impossible, compiling evidence against his own crumbling sanity. He transferred the raw image files to his computer, the progress bar crawling across the screen with agonizing slowness. Finally, the folder populated. He selected the sharpest image and opened it in his photo editing software, the vast, empty field filling his screen. He drew a selection box around the distant painted house and zoomed in. 100%, 200%, 400%. The image began to degrade into its constituent parts. The smooth lines of the roof became jagged steps of pixels. The texture of the canvas became a visible grid. He zoomed further, to 800%, his face now pressed close to the monitor. And there it was, the tiny pinprick of light, now resolved into a blurry, ambiguous block of 4 yellow pixels, surrounded by the dark pixels of the window. His heart sank. The proof was useless. The objective, unforgiving eye of the camera had failed him. To his own eyes, the light was a clear, undeniable point of brilliance. On the screen, it was a smudge. It could be anything. A digital artifact from the sensor, a stray fleck of pigment he had never noticed before, a discoloration in the canvas itself. There was no way to show this to someone else and say, look at the light. They would see nothing but a noisy, over-magnified image. The photograph, his anchor to reality, had betrayed him. It offered no validation, only more ambiguity. The terror was his alone, trapped in the space between what he could see and what he could prove. The silence of the house pressed in on him, no longer a comfort, but a form of solitary confinement. He needed to hear a voice. He needed another human being to tell him he was not insane. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone and scrolled to his sister's name, Chloe. She was 2 years younger, a pragmatic elementary school teacher who lived 3 towns over. Their relationship was one of affectionate distance, maintained through sporadic texts and holiday visits. Calling her at nearly 3 in the morning was a violation of their unspoken rules, a red flag he knew she would see immediately. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button, the shame of his own fear warring with his desperate need for connection. He pressed it, the narration of the call, as it played out in his own mind, was a disaster. He heard his own voice, strained and high-pitched, trying to explain the unexplainable, the words tumbling out in a disorganized torrent. The thrift store, the landscape, the house, the light. He could picture Chloe on the other end, sitting up in bed, her expression shifting from sleepy confusion to genuine concern, but a concern directed at him, not at his story. He registered the strained patience in her voice as she offered logical explanations. It was late. He was overworked. His mind was playing tricks on him. She suggested he take a break, maybe see a doctor, get his eyes checked. Every rational suggestion was a nail in the coffin of his credibility. He wasn't being heard. He was being diagnosed. The call ended with her promising to visit the next day, a promise that felt more like a threat of assessment. He hung up the phone, and the silence that rushed back in was heavier, colder. He was more alone now than he had been before he made the call. He couldn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night in the living room, on the far side of the house, as far from the office and its malevolent passenger as he could get. He sat in the dark, watching the first gray hints of dawn creep through the blinds, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He avoided the office all day, setting up his laptop on the dining room table, trying to lose himself in the familiar logic of his work. But his focus was shattered. Every creak of the house, every shadow thrown by the passing sun, sent a jolt of anxiety through him. The painting was a silent, looming presence, its influence bleeding through the walls. He felt its pull, a morbid curiosity that he fought with every ounce of his will. But as evening approached, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He had to know. Steeling himself, he walked back into the office. The air was cold, stagnant. He forced his eyes to the canvas. The house was still there. The tiny light in the window was gone. But a new devastating violation had occurred. To the right of the painted house, a new element had been added to the composition. It was the old, gnarled oak tree from his own backyard, the one whose branches scraped against his bedroom window during storms. It was rendered in perfect, terrifying detail, the distinctive pattern of its bark, the jagged scar where a branch had broken off last winter, the exact configuration of its twisted limbs. The invasion was accelerating, its territory expanding. It was no longer just claiming his house. It was claiming the world around it. It was claiming his world. The shift from passive fear to active desperation was a chemical change in his blood. If he could not get validation from the outside world, then he would have to find answers himself. If the what was impossible to prove, he would focus on the why. He turned his obsessive energy away from the canvas and toward the only clue he had, the artist's signature, K. Sternwood. He sat at his computer, not as a designer, but as a detective. He began a methodical deep dive into the digital world, a frantic search for the ghost who had painted his prison. He scoured online art databases, cross-referencing museum collections and auction house records. Nothing. He shifted to historical archives, searching census records and city directories from the turn of the century, hoping for a match. The name Sternwood was common enough, but no K. Sternwood was listed with the profession of artist. He spent hours falling down rabbit holes of genealogy websites, tracing family trees, looking for any mention of a painter in the family. Each failed search, each dead end, amplified his terror. The anonymity of the artist was a new kind of horror. This wasn't the work of a known cursed painter from a Gothic legend. This felt personal, bespoke. It was a haunting crafted just for him by a creator who had seemingly erased himself from history, leaving behind only his predatory, evolving work. After 2 days of fruitless online searching, Arthur knew he had to venture back into the physical world. The internet was vast, but finite. He needed he needed dust. He needed the analog records of the local library's historical archive. The library itself was a relic, a hushed sanctuary of wood paneling and the gentle scent of decaying paper. The silence here was different from the silence in his home. It was a peaceful, academic quiet, not a watchful, predatory one. He approached the main reference desk, his throat dry. A librarian, a young woman named Sarah with kind eyes and a name tag that identified her as such, looked up from a book and smiled. The simple, human gesture was so disarming it almost broke him. He explained his quest in cautious, edited terms, leaving out the impossible parts. He was researching a regional artist, he said, from the late 19th or early 20th century, possibly an itinerant painter. The only information he had was a signed name, K. Sternwood. Sarah's professionalism was a balm on his frayed nerves. She listened patiently, typed into her terminal, and frowned. As he expected, she found nothing in the main digital catalog, but she didn't give up. She led him to the back of the library, to a climate-controlled room filled with gray metal shelves. She pointed him toward a series of heavy, dusty binders containing the photocopied records of local art auctions and estate sales dating back to the 1880s. It was a long shot, she admitted, but artists who weren't famous enough for the big databases often appeared in these hyperlocal records. For a brief moment, Standing in that quiet room, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that he was not entirely powerless. He returned home with a renewed sense of purpose, the heavy research binders a tangible weight in his bag. For the first time in days, he felt a sliver of control, a belief that an answer, however terrible, might be found. He walked into his office, intending to go straight to the binders and begin the painstaking work of poring over the old records. But his eyes, as if by magnetic pull, went first to the painting on the wall. He had to check. He had to know its current state. He scanned the canvas from a distance, a morbid but necessary ritual. The gnarled oak tree was still there, a dark silhouette against the bruised purple sky. The replica of his house stood silently beside it. His eyes darted to the upstairs window, the one where the pinprick of light had appeared. The light was gone. A wave of relief, so powerful it made his knees weak, washed over him. For one glorious, foolish heartbeat, he allowed himself to think it was over, that the phenomenon had ceased, that it had all been a terrible, week-long hallucination. But the relief was a cruel trick, a moment of calm designed to make the next wave of horror hit with even greater force. His eyes adjusted to the painted gloom. The light was gone. Yes, but something else had taken its place. Standing on the tiny, perfectly rendered porch of his own duplicated house, a new shape had materialized. It was a human figure. It was small, indistinct, little more than a vertical smudge of dark umber paint against the muted background. But it was undeniably the shape of a person. The figure was standing perfectly still, its back to the viewer, looking out at the painted sunset, as if enjoying the view from the porch of its new home. The figure stood on the porch, a silent, featureless sentinel. Arthur remained frozen, his entire being locked in a state of primal shock that superseded thought. The world had narrowed to the space between his eyes and the canvas, a space filled with impossible truths. This was not a smudge of paint, not a trick of shadow and light his mind could eventually rationalize. It was a shape, definitive and deliberate, possessing the unmistakable verticality of a standing man. Its posture was one of serene ownership, its back turned to him as it gazed into the painted abyss of the sunset. It was the posture of someone at home, enjoying a quiet evening. The sheer placidity of the figure was a profound psychological violence. It was not a monster clawing its way out of the frame. It was a resident, calm and composed. Its refusal to acknowledge him, to turn and face him, was an assertion of dominance. It communicated a terrifying message. Arthur was the intruder in his own reality, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that was being systematically unwritten and then repainted by a silent, patient artist. His fear, once a frantic, panicked bird in his chest, now collapsed into a cold, heavy stone of dread in his stomach. The painting was no longer a mirror reflecting his world. It was a stage, and a new actor had just made his entrance. Sleep was not an option. It was a territory that had been conquered by the enemy. To close his eyes would be to cede the last bastion of his awareness, to leave the silent figure on the porch unwatched. So he began his vigil. He remained in his office chair throughout the long, suffocating hours of the night, a sentinel guarding against an invasion that had already breached the gates. The house, once his sanctuary, became an orchestra of menacing sounds. The gentle groan of the pipes in the walls became the house, sighing in resignation to its new master. The cyclical hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen became a low, monotonous chant, counting down the seconds of his sanity. He kept all the lights in the office blazing, a futile attempt to ward off the encroaching shadows, but the light only served to illuminate the canvas with a stark, clinical clarity, making the tiny dark figure on the porch seem even more solid, more real. He watched it for hours, his eyes burning with exhaustion, expecting it to move, to turn, to offer some sign of its intent. But it remained perfectly still, an icon of patient malevolence. Its stillness was a form of torture, a war of attrition waged against his nerves. He was prey, pinned by the unwavering gaze of a predator that had not yet decided to strike, content to simply watch him unravel. The night stretched into an eternity, each passing minute a new layer of psychological pressure, leaving him frayed, sleep-deprived, and utterly terrified. As the first weak gray light of dawn filtered through the window, a new energy took hold of Arthur, the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. If he couldn't fight the entity in the painting, he would fight its history. He turned to the heavy research binders he had brought from the library, the promise of an answer, any answer, his only motivation. He cleared his desk, pushing aside his paid work without a second thought, and opened the first binder. The task was monumental, a search for a single name or description in a sea of mundane history. He began to sift through the pages, his designer's eyes scanning the yellowed typewritten lists of auction records from a forgotten time. The air filled with the musty scent of old paper and decaying binding glue. The names and descriptions of the artworks flowed past in a monotonous stream. Still life with pears and silver knife, portrait of a stern-faced gentleman, pastoral scene with sheep. Each entry was a ghost of a forgotten living room, a piece of someone's life now reduced to a single, dry line of text. He was excavating a graveyard of forgotten art, and the process was both hypnotic and maddening. The sheer volume of ordinary, unremarkable paintings made his own feel even more like a singular aberration, a cancerous cell in the healthy body of art history. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the turning of pages and the growing pile of discarded records. His initial hope began to curdle back into despair. The signature K. Sternwood was nowhere to be found. The painting, it seemed, was as anonymous as it was monstrous. He was on the third binder, his eyes gritty and unfocused from staring at the faded ink, when he found it. The name Sternwood was not there. Instead, his gaze snagged on a phrase, a piece of academic jargon that was so chillingly familiar, it made the air leave his lungs in a rush. The entry was from an estate sale catalog, dated 1928, for the property of a man named Alistair Finch, a name that echoed the one Chloe had found for him, the living art historian, though this man was long dead. Item number 42 on the list was described as unsigned landscape in oil, artist unknown, a large canvas depicting a field at sunset. It was generic enough, but then came the supplemental note, a small italicized sentence that had likely been added by the auctioneer as a legal disclaimer. Nota bene, object exhibits unusual chromatic sensitivity to ambient light and atmospheric conditions. Sold as is, where is. Arthur read the sentence again, and then a third time. Chromatic sensitivity, a sanitized clinical term for the horror he was living. It was proof. It was the objective language he had been desperately seeking. The rain, the shifting colors, the darkening sky. It wasn't his imagination. Someone else had seen it. Someone else had documented it, nearly a century ago. He was not the first. A wave of vindication washed over him, so powerful it almost made him dizzy. But the vindication was immediately followed by a far colder realization. If someone knew about the painting's properties in 1928, then its predatory evolution had been going on for a very, very long time. The discovery propelled him out of his chair. He had a thread, a name, Alistair Finch, the deceased owner, and a technical description. He strode back towards the painting, feeling a surge of defiant energy, the feeling of a detective who has just found his first major clue. He would look at it now, not with fear, but with an analytical eye. He stopped short. The porch was empty. The dark human figure that had stood there for the entire night had vanished. For a moment, he felt a disorienting lurch, questioning if the figure had ever been there at all, if the sleep deprivation had finally pushed him over the edge into full-blown hallucination. But his gut knew better. This was not a reprieve. It was a new phase of the attack. His eyes scanned the canvas, searching for the next violation. He found it on the porch where the figure had been standing. A new object had appeared. It was a miniature wooden easel, no bigger than his thumb, rendered in perfect three-dimensional detail, and resting on that tiny easel was an even tinier blank canvas. As he stared, his mind refusing to process the sheer audacity of the change, a new horror unfolded. Before his very eyes, a thin, dark line, like a stroke of ink from an invisible pen, appeared on the miniature canvas. Then another and another. A sketch was forming. It was a crude, embryonic drawing, but Arthur could recognize the emerging shapes with sickening certainty. It was the interior of a room. It was the outline of a desk, a chair, a large rectangular window. It was his office. The painting was now painting him. That was the breaking point. The passive observation had turned into an active, metatextual assault. The painting was no longer just absorbing his world. It was documenting him within it, turning him into a piece of its own composition. The psychological barrier between observer and observed crumbled into dust. He stumbled back, grabbing his phone. He found the number for the living Dr. Alistair Finch, the esteemed art historian Chloe had recommended. This time, there was no panic in his voice, no frantic pleading. The terror had burned past that, leaving behind only a cold, hard resolve. When Dr. Finch answered, his voice a reedy but sharp baritone, Arthur spoke with an unnerving calm. He did not mention a changing landscape or a haunted canvas. He was methodical. He introduced himself as an independent researcher who had acquired a piece he believed to be from the lost Sternwood School of Regional Painters. He said he had found a reference to a similar piece in the 1928 estate records of one of the historian's namesakes. He used the term he had discovered, stating that the piece exhibited a remarkable chromatic sensitivity, and he wished to have an expert opinion. The bait was perfect. The mention of a lost school, a historical namesake, and a cryptic technical term was irresistible to a man like Finch. The historian's curiosity was piqued. He agreed to a visit the following afternoon. The next 24 hours were the longest of Arthur's life. Waiting for Dr. Finch's arrival was a unique form of torture, a race against the insidious artistry of the canvas. Every hour that passed felt like a victory for the painting, another chance for it to further its horrifying work. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, more suffocating. The sensory violations intensified. He began to notice new smells emanating faintly from the painting's direction. Sometimes it was the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the smell of an autumn field after a rain. At other times, it was the sharp, clean scent of pine needles, so vivid he almost expected to see them scattered on the floor. The auditory phenomena also grew more distinct. At night, when the house was completely still, he could hear a low, almost subsonic hum coming from the wall where the painting hung, a vibration he felt more in his bones than in his ears. He was living inside a sensory illusion, his reality being hijacked by an object that was projecting its world into his. He sealed the office door, unable to bear watching the tiny sketch on the miniature easel develop any further, but he could not seal out the smells or the sounds. He was a prisoner, waiting for an expert to arrive and diagnose the nature of his cell. The ring of the doorbell was a gunshot in the silent house. Arthur's heart leapt into his throat. He opened the door to find a man in his late 70s, tall and lean with a tweed jacket and a pair of eyes that were startlingly sharp and intelligent. It was Dr. Alistair Finch. After a brief, formal greeting, Arthur led him down the hall towards the office. He pushed the door open, his own eyes avoiding the canvas, focusing instead on the historian's reaction. Dr. Finch stopped dead in the doorway, his professional gaze instantly locking onto the painting. He did not speak. He did not move for what felt like a full minute, his body rigid. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Arthur watched the old man's face, a canvas in itself, as his expression shifted from academic curiosity to puzzlement, then to a dawning unease. Finally, Dr. Finch walked slowly into the room, his attention utterly consumed by the painting, ignoring Arthur completely. He approached the wall, his movements losing their earlier confidence. He squinted, leaning in, his nose almost touching the surface as he examined the thick impasto of the grass, the faded signature, and the impossible miniature easel on the painted porch. His carefully constructed professional demeanor began to visibly crumble. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like pale wax. He stumbled back a step, one hand instinctively going to his chest, as if to steady a suddenly racing heart. He turned to look at Arthur, and for the first time, the old man's sharp, intelligent eyes were wide, with a raw, undisguised terror that perfectly mirrored Arthur's own. He opened his mouth, and a dry, horrified whisper escaped his lips. "It's a camera obscura anime. A soul camera. A soul camera." Dr. Finch uttered the words in a breathy, horrified whisper, the sound barely audible over the frantic pounding in Arthur's own ears. The academic confidence had vanished from the old man's face, replaced by a raw, primal fear. The fear of a historian who had just come face to face with a piece of history that should have remained buried. He stumbled back another step, his eyes still locked on the canvas, his hand trembling as he pointed a finger at it. He began to speak, his voice a torrent of terrified exposition, the dam of his professional composure utterly broken. This was not a painting in any traditional sense, he explained. It was the result of a forbidden and perverse practice, a fusion of occult ritual and alchemical artistry. The term camera obscura anime was a piece of arcane lore, a whispered legend in the darkest corners of art history, referring to a process where a canvas was prepared not with gesso and primer, but with a mixture of psychotropic herbs, human ashes, and light-sensitive silver salts. The artist, a man he now identified with certainty as Carl Sternwood, not a simple landscape painter, but a notorious fringe occultist from the late 19th century, had not sought to capture images. He had sought to capture reality itself. The canvas was a trap, a parasitic dimension disguised as art. It operated on a slow, insidious timeline, first attuning itself to its new environment, its new owner, by mirroring their world. Then it would begin the absorption. Dr. Finch's words painted a picture far more terrifying than the canvas itself. He explained that the painting fed on attention, on focus, on fear. The more Arthur had obsessed over it, the more he had studied its changes and feared its presence, the more potent and rapid its influence became. He was watering a carnivorous plant with his own sanity. The historian's connection to the piece was terrifyingly personal. The Alistair Finch from the 1928 estate sale, he revealed, was his great-uncle, an obsessive collector of occult artifacts who had vanished without a trace. His entire estate was sold off, and the strange landscape painting was just one item among many. Its cryptic description, the only clue to its true nature. Dr. Finch had spent his career searching for his great-uncle's lost collection, and now he had found the centerpiece, the very object that had likely consumed his ancestor. He gestured weakly toward the painting. The dark, indistinct figure that had appeared on the porch, he theorized, was likely the owner who came before Arthur. Their identity, their very soul, now reduced to a permanent, featureless detail in the ever-evolving composition. The entire sequence of events, Arthur now understood, was a perfectly curated hunt. The thrift store, a place of forgotten things, was the perfect lair for such an object, and its keeper, the unsettling Mr. Croft, was no simple shopkeeper. He was a modern-day familiar, a cursed guardian tasked with ensuring the camera was always passed on to a new, suitable subject, someone isolated, someone attentive, someone whose reality was contained enough to be easily consumed. It wasn't a purchase. It was a transfer of a curse. The horrifying clarity of the revelation did not paralyze Arthur. It ignited him. A final, desperate surge of adrenaline, the fight-or-flight instinct, making its last stand, propelled him into action. While Dr. Finch was still speaking, his voice trembling with historical dread, Arthur let out a guttural cry and lunged. He grabbed the heaviest object on his desk, a solid glass award he had won years ago for a design campaign, its weight a dense, reassuring presence in his hand. He rushed toward the painting, his vision narrowing to a single point on the canvas, the miniature replica of his own house. He would smash it. He would shatter this parasitic world. He raised the glass trophy high and brought it down with all the force his terrified body could muster. The impact never came. In the final inches before the glass would have made contact with the canvas, it struck an invisible, yielding barrier. The air itself seemed to turn to dense jelly, arresting the motion of his arm completely. He was thrown off balance, stumbling backward, the glass award clattering uselessly to the floor. He stared, panting. The painting was untouched, its surface serene, its varnish gleaming under the office lights. He scrambled for a new weapon, his eyes landing on a utility knife in his desk drawer. He grabbed it, flicked open the blade, and lunged again, this time aiming to slash, to shred the canvas from its frame. The razor-sharp tip of the blade met the surface, and it was like trying to cut stone. The blade skittered across the varnish without leaving so much as a scratch. The sound, a shrill metallic shriek in the silent room. The painting was not a physical object anymore. It was an aperture to another place, and its surface was inviolable, protected by laws of physics that no longer applied in this compromised space. His failed assault triggered a catastrophic retaliation. It was as if his act of aggression had completed the final circuit, giving the painting permission to begin its final, overt consumption of his world. The process, which had been insidious and gradual, now accelerated with terrifying speed. The very texture of the room began to shift. Arthur looked at his own hands, and for a moment they seemed flat, their contours losing their depth, like a poorly rendered illustration. He touched the plaster wall beside him, and it felt smooth and unnaturally slick, the familiar gritty texture replaced by the feeling of gessoed canvas. The light in the room grew dim, the artificial glow of his desk lamp taking on the warm, bruised purple quality of the painted sunset. A profound, disorienting vertigo washed over him as his senses were systematically hijacked. The air grew thick, the sterile scent of his office replaced by the rich, loamy smell of damp earth and the sharp, resinous aroma of pine trees. The low hum of his computer faded away, and in its place, he could hear a new sound, the gentle, rustling whisper of a non-existent wind blowing through the tall, golden grass of the painted field. The barrier between his office and the world on the canvas was dissolving, and his reality, solid and real only moments ago, was now revealed to be a fragile, impermeable membrane, and it was breaking apart. Dr. Finch watched the beginning of this final transformation. His face, a mask of academic horror and human pity. He saw the change in the room's light, saw the dazed, unfocused look in Arthur's eyes. He knew what was happening. He had read about it in his great-uncle's journals, cryptic entries about perceptual transference and environmental assimilation. There was nothing he could do. He was a man of books and theories, not of exorcisms and supernatural warfare. To stay any longer would be to risk his own sanity, perhaps even his own soul. His survival instinct, a force far more ancient and powerful than his academic curiosity, screamed at him to flee. With a final sorrowful look at Arthur, a look of a doctor abandoning a terminal patient, he backed us slowly, his feet shuffling towards the door. He did not say goodbye. There were no words for this kind of departure. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing down the hall, the sound of the front door slamming shut, a final, definitive punctuation mark on Arthur's abandonment. He was left alone, completely and utterly, to face the unraveling of his world with no witnesses. The last voice of reason had run screaming into the night, leaving him in the clutches of a silent, beautiful, and utterly ravenous work of art. The frantic energy of his struggle drained away, replaced by a strange and profound exhaustion. He stood in the center of the room, his body trembling, as the sensory bleed from the painting intensified. He felt a gentle, insistent pull towards the canvas, not a physical force, but a psychic one, a quiet invitation to stop fighting. It was the call of a siren, promising peace. He looked at the painting, and the terror that had consumed him for days began to subside, replaced by a sense of exhausted resignation. He was tired of being afraid. He was tired of fighting. His gaze fell upon the painted field, and for the first time since the horror began, he saw its original beauty again. The tranquility, the peaceful solitude, the promise of a world without deadlines or anxiety or fear. It looked like a release. It looked like home. A strange, serene smile touched his lips. He took a hesitant step towards the wall, then another. The feeling of the carpet under his shoes began to change, the synthetic fibers softening, becoming the springy, uneven ground of a field. The cool, conditioned air of his office warmed on his skin, becoming the gentle, evening air of the world within the frame. His final moments were a quiet, surreal blur of collapsing realities. The scent of turpentine was the last familiar smell of his world, and the whisper of the wind through the grass was the first sound of his new one. The perspective pulls back. It is no longer tied to Arthur. We see the office now quiet and still. A man was standing there a moment ago, but now there is no one. The room is empty. The utility knife lies on the floor. The chair is overturned. On the wall, the painting hangs, serene and beautiful. It depicts a field at sunset, an old oak tree, and a small house. The tiny easel that had been on the porch is gone. Everything is as it was in the beginning. A perfect, peaceful landscape. The camera moves, pulling back through the office window, rising above the house, watching as the seasons change in a cascade of sped-up images. Snow covers the roof and melts. The leaves on the real oak tree bud turn green, then gold, then fall again. A for sale sign appears in the yard, is replaced by a sold sign. New cars appear in the driveway. Time passes. The scene dissolves and reforms in a different city, in a different time. We are inside a small, dusty antique shop filled with forgotten treasures. A young woman with an artist's portfolio under her arm is admiring a large, captivating landscape painting. She speaks to the shopkeeper, commenting on its profound sense of peace, how it would be perfect for her new studio. The shopkeeper, a very old man with cloudy, pale blue eyes, smiles a thin, knowing smile and begins to wrap her purchase. The final shot is a slow, deliberate zoom, pushing past the woman, past the shopkeeper, into the surface of the canvas she holds. On the porch of the small house in the painting, a single, dark figure stands with its back to the viewer, watching the sunset, and next to it, a second, slightly smaller figure has just appeared. And with that, their story came to an end. But it leaves one last question for you. You hang a thrift store painting in your room. A week later, you realize the landscape is changing to show the inside of your own house. You're alone. What is the absolute first thing you do? Share your answer in the comments below. See you in the next one.